What if China invaded India? China and India are the two most populated countries on the entire planet, with populations of 1.4 billion and 1.3 billion respectively, and together making up literally 36.17% of the world's population. A modern war between these two countries would be one of the largest events in human history, splitting the continent of Asia in two and putting over a third of human life on the planet at risk. But how would a military invasion of India by China play out? Why would one happen in the first place? And how would the rest of the world respond? These are the questions we're going to try and answer today. Now, China and India have an incredibly complicated history, which is to be expected given the size of the countries and their locations being located right next to each other on the Eurasian continental landmass and sharing a border that's also made up of the Himalayan mountains. This border is what caused the most recent military conflict between India and China back in 1962. After the 1959 Tibetan uprising, during which the Dalai Lama, the religious leader of Tibet, fled to India, China began to become more aggressive on the border shared with India in the Himalayan mountains. India began to place more and more outposts on their side of the mountains as they were worried that China could be looking to expand and would use India's housing of the Dalai Lama as an excuse to hasten this expansion. After India rejected several proposals by China for their own diplomatic outposts in the region, China began to get more and more aggressive before finally outright crossing the established border and attempting to invade on October 20th, 1962. While India had been worried about China's activity in the region, they were unprepared for a full-on invasion and thus scrambled to get as many troops as possible to the mountains. What followed is now known as the Sino-Indian War, a rather unique modern battle that had no air or naval component, as the entirety of combat took place within the Himalayan mountains at altitudes that made those two forms of warfare highly inefficient, with much of the fighting taking place in harsh mountain conditions at 4,000 meters or 13,000 feet above sea level. Fighting would have been brutal and slow-moving, with Chinese forces attempting to invade from both an eastern and western front, and Indian forces only barely able to hold them off. Eventually, however, Chinese forces were able to gain enough ground until they'd passed the line that China had deemed as the true border between India and China. Following the passing of this line, China immediately declared a ceasefire, content with the new position they'd carved out, and India eventually decided to agree to the ceasefire, despite the loss of territory. This was also a blow to the Soviet Union, who had recently begun to have deteriorating relationships with China as well, and had attempted to supply India with Russian aircraft after both the United States and Britain had refused to assist India in the conflict. Unfortunately, those planes never got to be used in this conflict, and despite outcry from European countries and America at China's bold advancement into Indian territory, no real retaliation ever came about. All of this is to say that India and China's border relations have been a bit strained ever since, and have seen some increased activity especially within the last couple of years. India having to move its borders in 1962 was seen as a major political failure at the time, and presidents that have ruled the country since have made it a priority to increase India's defenses and defensive budget to ensure that such a bold expansion by China could never happen again. So, could China actually be successful at a full invasion of India in the modern age? During any of the small altercations that have briefly happened on the border since 1962, India has been able to dissuade China from advancing any further by parking a multitude of tanks on their side of the border at whichever location China seems interested in. But if China was 100% committed to further expansion, or felt that India had enough of a resource that it might need more of, such as natural oil or spring water as the planet's climate continues to change and fresh water becomes a rarer and rarer commodity, they might commit to attempting to attack India's tank platoons. Both countries are fairly evenly matched from a military perspective, but with China winning a bit in the numbers department, with the Indian Army boasting 1.13 million troops with 2.1 million in reserve, and China having 2.3 million active troops with 2.3 million in reserve. From a technology perspective, China again has a little bit of an advantage, but its biggest leap ahead of India's army is actually its air force, which has been modernized in recent years compared to India's planes that they're still maintaining from the Soviet Union's gift during the Cold War. However, this isn't as big an issue as you might think, as again, the border between China and India is at an elevation and terrain that simply aren't ideal for aerial support or bombardments. The same goes for the two countries' navies. China technically has a bit of a numbers and technology edge, but there's little use for naval warfare in the middle of the mountains. An interesting wrinkle to this, however, is that many of China's shipping routes do run incredibly close to the Indian Sea, meaning that China would need to commit troops to protecting those supply lines if they were to become enemies with India again. These shipping routes would be incredibly easy targets for India to take advantage of, and would let them be able to harm China economically without even having to face them directly. This invasion would mostly have to play out like the Sino-Indian War, mainly focusing on ground troops, and with the fighting taking place in territory that is slow to capture and slow to advance through. China would have to commit an extraordinary amount of troops to break through the mountainous borders, and despite their lower numbers, India would have the advantage from decades of training at defending their borders, and being able to form defenses involving the local terrain and their large amount of tanks. Of course, there is the possibility of nuclear weaponry, given that both China and India are believed to be fully nuclear capable states at this point in time, but this likely wouldn't come to pass no matter how aggressive the fighting between China and India got. Both countries have a strict no first use policy for their most destructive weapons, and unleashing a nuke on your next door neighbor is probably not a good idea if you want to maintain any sort of good graces with any other major country in the world. At the end of the day, any invasion of India by China would be a massive geopolitical event unlike any we've yet to see in the 21st century. These two massive countries have had a strained relationship before, but escalating into full-on warfare would put all of the Earth's nations on alert and wary about what is going to happen next. Alliances would have to be made, redrawn, or altered as countries both within and without the United Nations decide which side to support in the conflict, or whether they should stay on the sidelines and wait and see how the conflict winds up going. Either way, everyone on Earth would be impacted in some way, whether it's because of the tremendous supply chain issues that would undoubtedly come about due to a war taking up much of Asia, or the literally billions of people suddenly thrown into chaos when their two countries suddenly go to war. Either way, as always, we would only be able to hope for the most peaceful resolution possible, and hope that the world would eventually settle down again. So what do you think would happen? Let us know down in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video and analysis, be sure to hit the like button and the subscribe button to keep up to date with everything we do on the channel and more. As always, I've been Josh Busker, and this has been Life's Biggest Questions.